My hope is that on your way out tonight, you will have been impacted, you will have been challenged, perhaps inspired, and that you will leave the school gymnasium with a slightly new and broader view of the world. And I think you will, because tonight we are here with a truly great Canadian. As an orator, he touched people across the country with the beautiful eulogy he gave to Jack Layton. As a statesman, he led the Ontario New Democratic Party. As a diplomat, he served as Canada's ambassador to the United Nations. As a humanitarian, he was made deputy director of UNICEF, and in 2001, he was appointed the UN Secretary General's Special Envoy for HIV/AIDS. It was during this time that Stephen Lewis encountered an award-winning documentary filmmaker from Salt Spring Island. Judy Jackson followed Stephen Lewis as he bore witness to the pandemic that was raging across Africa. Judy created a trilogy of documentaries about his work. Many of you will remember these incredibly powerful films. In 2004, her film, The Value of Life, aired on CBC's The Nature of Things with David Suzuki. And the impact was immediate. Within a week, Canadians across the country donated $120,000 to the Stephen Lewis Foundation. You will also remember that Judy brought Stephen Lewis back to Salt Spring. And in doing so, she created a special relationship between him and this community that is clearly alive and well today. For that reason, there is no one better to welcome Stephen Lewis back to Salt Spring than our very own Judy Jackson. Please give her a warm welcome.
Stephen, thank you for coming all the way to our little island to be with us. We so appreciate it. In my eyes, Stephen Lewis is heroic, unflinching, and incredibly compassionate. I could talk all night about all that he's achieved and is still achieving, but I'll keep it personal. I first met Stephen in 2001, just as he was appointed UN HIV/AIDS envoy to Africa. I wanted to follow his work for a CBC Nature of Things documentary. So began my journeys. They turned into 3 films of chasing Stephen Lewis across Africa. He went at breakneck speed, often dashing around an entire country in a day or 2. His work was also so thorough, ranging from meetings with government officials to meetings with the marginalized, NGOs trying to help at the grassroots level, associations of people living with HIV/AIDS, visits to orphanages, hospitals, and grandmothers struggling to raise orphan grandchildren in shanty towns. I would end each day completely exhausted, but not Stephen. His energy is endless. It was incredible to watch him bringing his all-inclusive knowledge and abilities, negotiating change on even the thorniest of issues. At the beginning, antiretroviral drugs were not available except for the rich, and there was a sense of death overpowering the continent. I remember sitting with Stephen in the airport in Kigali, Rwanda, and I asked him how he had the courage to do this seemingly impossible work. "You just keep fighting," he said, "until you see a little light at the end of the tunnel." By the end of his term, his hard work had produced much light. Generic drugs were much more widely available. There was a sense that the AIDS pandemic could be overcome. And the grandmother movement, started by the Stephen Lewis Foundation, was growing right across Canada and Africa. And even in the most intractable case, the denialist attitude of the South African government had changed because Stephen Lewis bravely spoke out, putting his job on the line as he did so. I know that Stephen is going to talk about Millennium Development Goals tonight, but I think after he's spoken, we're going to come back to the grandmother movement and have some questions and answers about that, because I know many people here are very much involved with that. Stephen, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I love Judy Jackson. You could not imagine a more enviable situation than to traverse the continent in the midst of a pandemic with a brilliant documentary filmmaker who in her soul felt every moment of pain and anguish and hope as much as I did, certainly. And it is very special to me to have been introduced by Judy and to return to this wonderful island where a few years ago I had the opportunity of speaking when I was doing the envoy work. I'm enormously tickled to be here tonight. I'm going to break all manners of protocol because I want all of you to know that in our midst is Nigel Fisher. Nigel, why don't you stand for a second so people can see you? You won't know this, most of you, but Nigel effectively heads the United Nations work in Haiti. An astonishing job, which he is doing with a kind of monumental capacity. Nigel and I worked together at UNICEF for a number of years. We were good friends. We collaborated on many activities. He's a remarkably able person, and it is, I think, quintessentially appropriate that he should now be part of Salt Spring Island, since out of this island flows everything that verges on angelic perfection. I couldn't help but smile to myself, albeit slightly grimly, at the reference from John Michael about my NDP stewardship, which I think it's important for all of you collectively to know that when I was leader of the NDP in Ontario in the 1970s, it was an exercise in almost transcendental futility. And I don't want you to be under any assumptions that I was a political leader of note. On the other hand, I love coming to British Columbia because it has the most lunatic political culture in the country. I'm also jet-lagged. I have a lousy cold. I got the cold in Moscow, a more sorry, dreary, disreputable place I've seldom been to. A combination of Stalinist architecture on the one hand and Las Vegas glitz on the other. I'm not sure how I survived it. An entirely and clearly totalitarian state, very depressing in fact. So I beg you to allow the milk of human kindness to flow through your veins and treat me with compassion. I wasn't sure what I should speak to tonight. This assemblage is driven in significant measure by the grandmothers of Salt Spring Island, and they are, you will admit collectively, a wonderful crew. Let me give you one piece of statistical data which will, I think, surprise you. The grandmothers of Canada, in the service of the grandmothers of Africa through my foundation, have since July 2007 raised $12 million. It's astonishing, and in the process they have obviously transformed huge numbers of lives and saved lives and made life palatable for people for whom otherwise life would be desperately vulnerable and desolate. And the grandmothers of Salt Spring have been an absolutely integral part of that whole process. And I just want to begin at the outset by thanking them in your presence, because inordinately you are legendary in the annals of the Stephen Lewis Foundation. And when I say that, I say it on behalf of the entire staff. I wasn't sure what I wanted to speak to, and then I was told by John Michael and others that I was to speak to the Millennium Development Goals, and I was to speak about women, and I was to speak about HIV and AIDS. And because I follow with an almost religious fidelity the directives I am given, I will reconnoiter all of those matters, and I will do it, if I may, within the context of the Millennium Development Goals, because it is such a perfect context for some of the things I'd very much like to share. You may recall that back in the year 2000, the United Nations got together and without a single dissenting voice decided to launch the Millennium Development Goals, 8 goals which were to be achieved by the year 2015. It's rather interesting, actually, because originally that Millennium Gathering in 2000 was meant to deal with globalization, on the assumption that globalization would usher in a period of cultural, economic, and social harmony internationally. And as the 1990s evolved, it became clearer and clearer that globalization was having very destructive and damaging effects in the world. So they decided to shift the ethos, and they would have a Millennium Assembly which would set targets and goals, the objective of which was to overcome the excruciating disparity between the developed and the developing worlds. And that they did. We're not going to reach many of the goals. We're certainly not going to reach them in sub-Saharan Africa, upon which I will draw extensively tonight, because I admit it is the part of the world which I more or less know best. But the first Millennium Development Goal, and the one that underpins everything else, was to reduce the most egregious forms of poverty and hunger by half by the year 2015. According to the World Bank, we have 1.4 billion people living below $1.25 a day. We have roughly 3 billion people living below $2 a day. The dimensions of the poverty, the evisceration of individuals and families is almost unspeakable. And everyone is hungry in so many countries. It's particularly true of so many of the African countries. I remember I was recently in Swaziland, and I was traveling in Swaziland with the organization that looks after women living with AIDS called SWAPO, which is headed by a quite remarkable woman named Sipiwe Hlopi. And we were visiting child-headed households initially. I remember the first household. Let me just relate these anecdotes to you, because they speak both to the work of the foundation and the reality with which we're dealing. We visited the first household, which had 3 young boys, the oldest of whom was 15, and he was the head of the family, and a young girl of 9 was the youngest. And their mother had died, and their father remarried, and then the father died. And the second wife, with her siblings, came to the home of the children and attempted to claim it in total. And when the children resisted and wanted to stay in their home, the house was stripped bare of every single possession, from blankets to pots. And when we visited, there was absolutely nothing. So naturally, we agreed that we would be able to refurbish the house to some extent. And as we were leaving, Sipiwe said, was there anything we could do, especially for the children? And the little girl of 9 threw herself into Sipiwe's skirt and wept uncontrollably. And Sipiwe said, what is happening? What's the problem? And the little girl said, we have a test tomorrow in school, and we have to bring our own pencils, and I don't have a pencil, so I can't take the test. And you stand there and you ask yourself, what is it about the inequality of the human condition that some children have to struggle so immensely? It racks their little souls over things which so much of the world takes absolutely for granted. We went off to the next home, which was actually being looked after by a grandmother. And these were orphan kids whose parents have died of AIDS. And the grandmother was lying on a fetid mat at the door. She was, in fact, herself wrestling with the AIDS virus. The kids were looking after her rather than she looking after them. And again, there were 5 children in the home, and we only saw 4 of them. And suddenly from the shadows there emerged a little girl, couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old, terribly disfigured of face and arm amputated at the shoulder, and she had been caught in a dreadful fire. And she was so self-conscious and so humiliated by being seen by others that you could see that she was completely clutched, and there was nothing but trauma that suffused her little soul. And there was nothing for her. There was no basis or capacity on which to respond. And again, you think to yourself, why is this necessary? Why has the world come to this? There is an never-ending array of resources. If you want to fight a war in Afghanistan, or you want to fight a war in Iraq, or you want to fight a war in Libya, or you want to spend trillions of dollars bailing out banks, but you can't raise a microscopic smidgen of that money to deal with the human condition in so many countries. It just drives me to distraction. And before we left our tour, we went to what was called a neighborhood care point, where new mothers got together to have a little community garden to grow some food for themselves. And they were all arrayed on the ground, about 100 women with their babes at their breast. And it was raining, and it was cold, and there was some brief speechifying. And then it ended, and we said goodbye, and we walked away, and I remember looking back, and all the mothers were lined up at the equivalent of a soup kitchen, receiving one bowl of gruel, which was to last them for 2 days. And I want to say to you that what the grandmothers are doing in this country to identify with the human struggle amongst wonderful people, generous, decent, sophisticated, with tremendous communities. What the grandmothers are doing here, what you're doing in your collective awareness, consciousness, concern, is inestimable. And around the realities of poverty and hunger, there is nothing more pressing. And if I can use the Millennium Development Goals in my own order rather than the order which the United Nations decreed, I would say that the second one was dramatically to reduce infant mortality rates and child mortality rates. Do you know that there are 9 million children a year now under the age of 5 who die annually from entirely preventable diseases? There's nothing exotic about these diseases. They die of pneumonia, they die of malnutrition, they die of diarrhea, they die of dehydration. They die of things which we no longer reconnoiter in the Western world. There are some things I just don't understand. I'm going to be 74 next month. I never thought I'd reach this point in life where the functioning of the species is incomprehensible to me. How is it possible that these things happen and we still haven't managed to marshal the kind of energy and concern which will bring them to an end? The third Millennium Development Goal is the dramatic reduction of maternal mortality. For the last 20 years, with a kind of methodical, demonic repetition, between 360,000 and 500,000 women die in childbirth every year. We've never been able to bring the numbers down. We know everything there is to know about emergency obstetric interventions. We know about midwives. We know about birth attendants. We know about moving a woman who is in critical labor from the rural hinterland into a district hospital. And we've never been able to reduce the carnage. So naturally, the reduction in maternal mortality became one of the Millennium Development Goals. And the fourth goal was to put every eligible child according to age into primary school. And there are still 70 to 100 million children in this world who are not in primary school. I promised myself that I wouldn't be too overtly political tonight. But damn it all, it's a large audience. And I'm also in a desperately Castro-like mood. I want to assure you that you can go out into the foyer of the school and have a coffee, chat with each other for a time, and come back in and be confident that I'll still be speaking. I just want to say in a kind of maniacal orgy of the democratic left that the reason all these kids aren't in school is because they can't afford the school fees, or the fees for textbooks, or the fees for parent-teacher relationships, or the fees for any of the particular adjuncts that are added to the cost of schools in so many developing countries. And the reason they can't pay the school fees is because it's courtesy of the World Bank. Because years ago in the 1980s and 1990s, the World Bank hatched this Reagan-esque proposition called structural adjustment programs. And they said to a number of countries, many of them headed by corrupt leaders, if you want money, we'll give you money, but we'll attach conditions. And the conditions were that you have to apply user fees. You have to start charging people for health, and you have to start charging people for education. And so countries which had never had school fees before suddenly had them imposed courtesy of the World Bank. Those intellectual artisans of crypto-fascism, I just can't stand them in what they've done. And the consequence of it was that huge numbers of children were precluded from going to school. It's just so painful. And of course, when you've got a situation where families get ill and young girls, it's always young girls, are pulled out of school to look after sick and ailing and dying parents, it's a terrible predicament, and it's something against which we're struggling. And changes are coming because country after country is now making it possible for kids to go to primary school without cost. But the secondary school situation remains grim, particularly for girls. And the fifth Millennium Development Goal is to approximate gender equality. And it is the goal about which I feel most strongly. I live in a feminist family. I say this with enormous pride. Just 3 days ago, my wife launched a book in the presence of 700 people called Writing the Revolution. It's the history of Canadian feminism as seen through many of Michelle's columns and a lot of additional writing. Some of you will know Michelle Landsberg. I know the name Michelle Landsberg. She is one of those redoubtable, principled, unflinching, gifted, socialist, feminist columnists for 25 and 30 years writing for the Toronto Star and the Globe and Mail. And she is profoundly opinionated. I have been able to phone home at any time of day or night in our 48 years of marriage and say, honey, what do I believe about so-and-so? And I am always told in no uncertain terms, and then I can come to evenings like these and disgorge views which you mistakenly think are my own. But I do want to say that I have come to recognize, I guess the instinct was always there, but I have come to recognize that the single most important struggle on the planet is the struggle for gender equality. You simply cannot continue to marginalize 50% of the world's people and expect ever to approximate social justice or equity. And when I see from the privileged position of internationalism the incredible discrimination and stigma and ignominy visited upon so many of the women of the world, it's impossible to absorb the panoply of discrimination, whether it's international sexual trafficking or female genital mutilation or child bride or the absence of property rights or the absence of inheritance rights or inadequate economic autonomy or no political autonomy or the consistent reality of rape and sexual violence. It just tears at one's sense of how the world should work. And it's only now that we're beginning to emerge even slightly from the phenomenon of gender inequality. I mean, everybody in this room must have felt good to see 3 women receive the Nobel Peace Prize. including Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the president of Liberia, whom I'm proud to call a friend, and I hope she's reelected. There's a runoff election coming in a week or two, and for my money, she's by far and away the most intelligent and principled president on the continent of Africa, the only woman, so you can well understand why that's the case. But it's a remarkable thing that it took to the year 2011 before we could confer Nobel Prizes on women for peace and for the work they do on women's rights. There is such an astonishing resistance within the international community to equality where women are concerned. The United Nations discovered two genders about 10 minutes ago. I was going to say 10 years ago, but that would be giving them the benefit of the doubt. And the current Secretary General is still struggling with the proposition that there are two sexes. Indeed, when he took his job, he said that he had the steepest learning curve at all to understand questions related to women's rights. The area which is most foreboding is the area of sexual violence. I don't know whether it is extraordinarily improved reporting or whether the contagion of sexual violence, as seems more likely, is simply an infestation across the world. But it is heartbreaking, soul-destroying, indefensible, and unconscionable what is happening. I remember the study that was done by the World Health Organization just a few years ago where they interviewed 25,000 women in 14 countries on questions of physical and sexual violence and found the lowest level of violence in Japan at 14% and the highest levels of violence in Bangladesh and rural Ethiopia at 72%. And when they did analogous studies in the United Kingdom, the United States, and Canada, they found the levels at 30 to 35%. Intimate partner violence, marital rape. It's just astounding what is going on. And wherever you turn, as Nigel can bear witness, you have a terrible earthquake in Haiti and you set up camps necessarily for people who are struggling in the consequences of the earthquake, and suddenly reports begin to flow of raping in the camps. You have a terrible war in Liberia from which it emerges, and the war ends and the raping continues, and the raping descends to young girls between the ages of 6 and 12. I remember sitting in the offices with Ellen Johnson Sirleaf and asking her, as President, Ellen, what's happening here? Why is this going on? The war is over. And she said, Stephen, I don't know. I don't entirely understand myself. And on International Women's Day, I'm going to assemble a large number of women from around the world who are frontline workers and understand the phenomenon and see if somehow we can't bring it to an end. You have a civil war in Cote d'Ivoire, and suddenly there is raping on both sides. I spend a lot of my time these days working for an NGO called AIDS Free World out of the United States. It often collaborates with the foundation. And in the middle of 2008, we were approached by a wonderful group called the Girl Child Network, which was attempting to protect 60 or 70,000 girls from sexual violence in a country which, as you know, was falling apart. And instead of doing the usual anecdotal stuff, my colleague said to me, why don't we take affidavits? Why don't we document this in unassailable and unanswerable fashion? So we spirited 70, 80 women out of the country. And we took affidavits using Canadian and American law firms in Botswana and in South Africa. And we established beyond the shadow of a doubt that the patterns of sexual violence and rape were visited by Mugabe's war veterans and youth corps solely and exclusively on the women who supported the opposition party. It was a rape that was electorally driven. It was incredible. And the patterns were always the same. They would come together wearing their ZANU-PF, which is the political party of Mugabe, T-shirts outside a home. They would wave various machetes in the air. They would storm the home. They would kill or dismember the male partner. They would then rape the woman in the presence of her partner and her children. They would take the women away to rape camps and rape them repeatedly over a period of 2 or 3 weeks. The narratives were soul-destroying. And everywhere the patterns were the same, and they all said the same thing as they raped the women. Tell this to Tony Blair. Tell this to George Bush. And when they finished the raping, of course, the communities were annihilated by what had happened. And we felt we had established beyond the shadow of a doubt crimes against humanity, and that we could draw a direct line to Mugabe and his cabinet. And we published it in a report called Electing to Rape: Sexual Terror in Mugabe's Zimbabwe. And that report is reverberating around southern Africa even now as we attempt to find a vehicle in one of the adjacent countries to get some of these perpetrators before the law. But the fact that you should have such politically orchestrated sexual violence is mind-numbing. And everybody knows it's happening. And the elections that are now set for 2012, the rape camps are in place again. And the war veterans and the youth corps are threatening again. And no matter how hard you try with the permanent members of the Security Council and with the upper echelons of the United Nations, it's almost impossible to get them engaged. And if you think it's bad in Zimbabwe, there was terrible sexual violence after the elections in Kenya in 2007, 2008, which may well begin again. So many of the women's groups are apprehensive about raising it. And in the Congo, it's simply beyond belief. We have 20,000 peacekeepers, the largest peacekeeping force in the world, and we can't stop the sexual violence. We have 12 United Nations agencies ostensibly united against the sexual violence, and you can't protect the women. We have Security Council resolution after Security Council resolution, and you can't protect the women. It's now been established that over the last several years there have been 1,000 women raped every day in the Congo. If you visit the little Panzi hospital in the regional capital of Bukavu, in the South Kivu province, in the eastern region of the Congo, and you spend time with the surgeons, they spend much of their time surgically repairing the reproductive tracts of the women. And I want to say to you that what has happened, of course, is that with the violence of the repetitive raping, the virus is transmitted. And more often the doctors are saying to us, the Panzi Hospital is headed by a wonderful doctor named Denis Mukwege. Denis will say to us, so many of the women are now HIV positive. He can't get over it. And so again, there is this link. And for those of you who've been kind enough to support the foundation has set up an institute for the prevention of sexual violence. And we have begun to gather frontline workers from many of the projects we support across the continent, and they will move. This is a way of moving people to crisis points to be able to help with the therapeutic responses that are required and to do the counseling with the victims and with the staff. And we did our first such training and counseling at the Panzi Hospital just a few weeks ago, where the women who were part of the institute were saying that they had never met a staff that was more traumatized by what they had seen and what they were dealing with. It was as though the entire edifice should have been turned into a mental health clinic. Our benefactor for all of this, the person who helps us oversee it, is a woman named Graça Machel. And the institute in its offices will be located in Graça's office in Johannesburg in South Africa. Graça is the former Minister of Education in Mozambique, the former First Lady of Mozambique. She is now married to Nelson Mandela. She is seen everywhere as Mama Africa, and the relationship between Graça and the foundation is one of those indelible relationships which will mean, I hope, a great deal to the women who are struggling so valiantly. I don't know how to break through Can I say it to you honestly? I have sat at the feet of the special representative of the Secretary General, Margot Wallstrom, on sexual violence. We have met with Baroness Amos, who heads the OCHA, the Office of Humanitarian Assistance Response. We have gone up the ladder to all of the agencies. I have a co-director, a woman named Paula Donovan from Boston, with whom I have worked for many years, and together we have made the arguments time and again, spoken, pleaded, driven, and you can't get the movement. And you can't get the movement because it's women. If this were men, it would have been over God knows how long ago. You've had a civil war raging in the Congo for forever. We have a principle in the United Nations on which everybody agreed in the year 2005, which was called the responsibility to protect. And when a country cannot protect the human rights of its own people, then the world has accepted the proposition that you have the responsibility to protect, and it can be done diplomatically, it can be done politically, and if necessary, it can be done militarily. And we started to use it in Libya, and we started to use it in Cote d'Ivoire, but we never seem to be willing to use it when there are women. The wonderful author of the Vagina Monologues, Eve Ensler, and her remarkable NGO called V-Day have created something called the City of Joy adjacent to the Pansy Hospital. The City of Joy is 100 buildings which women themselves have constructed, where the women who have been surgically treated will go to convalesce, learn a trade, go back to their community. And it was opened last February. I was at the opening with my son and daughter-in-law, as a matter of fact, and there were 3,000 women gathered, every single one of whom had been sexually violated. And half a dozen of these remarkably courageous women took to the platform, and they looked at the governor and all his satraps and sycophants who surrounded him, and they said with just enormous courage, if this were happening to men, Mr. Governor, you would have resolved this years ago. It's because it's women that you're so benighted and refusing to resolve it. One of the things I did a little myself, and so many others did more, was the struggle to create a new international agency for women at the United Nations. And incredibly enough, over a period of 4 or 5 years of pummeling away at the cerebral aristocrats who run the joint, we finally succeeded. And in February of this year, there was launched at the United Nations General Assembly a new international agency for women called UN Women, and the big question was, who would head it? And lo and behold, there emerged the former president of Chile, Michelle Bachelet, a remarkably gifted woman, quite out of the mainstream of the United Nations. She actually speaks her mind, and she doesn't dissolve into impenetrable diplomatic gobbledygook. And she's a socialist feminist. You would think there would have been cardiac arrests almost everywhere. But she's emerged as the Undersecretary General for UN Women, and it will make a huge difference to the activists on the ground who've never had voice and resources before. It's thrilling. So one hangs in, and the work of the foundation is indelibly tied to all of that activity around women's rights, and that's one of the major objectives of the Millennium Development Goals. And the 6th goal, don't despair, don't give up hope. I'm wending my way, and you can see that 6 is a long way to 8. The 6th goal is, of course, the need to turn back the pandemics of AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. And I want to say something about that. There is an assumption in the Western world that AIDS is now rendered unto a chronic disease, and you don't have to worry about it anymore on a continent like Africa. There are 6 million people who are now receiving antiretroviral treatment, and their lives are extended. There are 10 million people who require treatment now, and it's anybody's guess as to whether we'll get to them in time. And the toll continues because in years past, the immune system was so shattered for so many They came to treatment so late that they could never be fully restored. And 10 days ago, we lost one of the loveliest people it's ever been my privilege in life to know, a fellow called Winston Zulu, who was the premier AIDS activist in Zambia, and a man who sat with Nelson Mandela on the platform in the International AIDS Conference in Bangkok in 2004, as Nelson Mandela paid him tribute as one of the people who was the strongest advocates on the question of AIDS and tuberculosis. Winston was an unflinching, principled, uncompromising person around the virus. And he spoke truth not just to power, but to anyone who would hear. And he had 3 little children. His wife is also HIV positive, and all 3 kids are HIV negative. And of course, everyone will move heaven and earth to respond to the family. Winston was a very good friend of the foundation. He came to Toronto. He enrolled in Ryerson University. He audited journalism courses. He was a very, very fine journalist. He was such a sweet and principled man. It's such an agony to think of all those we've lost and continue to lose because the responses continue to be too incremental, not urgent enough. And what is so debilitating about it is that there's never been a more perfect time. Objectively, scientifically, epidemiologically, we are on the cusp of an absolute breakthrough. And interestingly enough, the breakthrough was orchestrated here in British Columbia. I hope everybody knows that. It was orchestrated by Dr. Julio Montaner, who heads the British Columbia Center of Excellence. And hi, Tony. I don't know whether you know, and let me take a minute to say it. Back in 2006, I remember because I was sitting beside Julio at a press conference, Julio advanced a proposition so simple and compelling that you wonder why it took 25 to 30 years for someone to figure it out in the course of the pandemic. And on the face of it, the logic is inescapable. What Julio said was, look, if you put people into antiretroviral treatment, as soon as you discover they're HIV positive, then you lower the viral load in the body to undetectable levels. And if they continue to have unprotected sex, the transmission of the virus is negligible or at very reduced rates. So that over a lengthy period of time, treatment becomes prevention. And the more people you treat, the more likely you will prevent transmission of the virus because the virus will be at undetectable levels in the body. And when Julio enunciated the theory, drawn from the work he had done here in British Columbia, he was mocked and ridiculed, and people said, oh, that's a fantastical idea, and how do you know what it will mean in the long run? And Julio kept pounding away at it. And then suddenly at the World Health Organization in 2008, they produced a study from 3 eminent people, the results of which were to confirm Julio's thesis. And the upper echelons of the World Health Organization were so aghast at having supported this delinquent scientist in British Columbia, wherever the hell that was, that the 3 men who authored the study are now off doing other things. But the study was of tremendous importance. And at the International AIDS Conference in Vienna in 2010, just last year, treatment as prevention became the mantra of the conference. Everyone seized upon it as the unfailing logic of Julio's proposition began to sink in, and as more and more people and groups began to want to try it out. And so finally, the National Institutes of Health in the United States, headed by Dr. Tony Fauci, the most preeminent of the preeminent, certainly in his own mind, the National Institutes of Health decided to do a major study looking at discordant couples. They had several thousand discordant couples where one was HIV positive and the other was HIV negative, and the HIV-positive member of the couple was on antiretroviral drugs, and they said, we will do a study over 3 or 4 years. We'll give you the results in 2013 to see if there is a significant reduction in transmission by virtue of the HIV-positive person in the discordant couple being on treatment. They stopped the study 2.5 years before its intended date, ending date, because the results were so dramatic they couldn't stop and wait until the study would end. They had to respond immediately. The results that came in showed that the reduction in transmission was 96%. So Julio Montaner was completely and totally vindicated. And now everybody is clamoring for treatment as prevention and to get more and more people tested and more people on treatment. And now I will tell you what I'm not supposed to know, but I do know, is that sometime early next week, Hillary Clinton is going to gather a few hundred people together to give a very strong shot in the arm to the principle of treatment as prevention, leading to an announcement on December the 1st, probably from President Obama himself, talking about the increased numbers that the American dollars expect to put into treatment by 2013, and maybe adding some money to those dollars as well. And it's all rooted back here in British Columbia. I mean, it's so interesting. Your Ministry of Health supported Julio strongly. There were constant epidemiological sources of data provided. It was unassailable, and it could turn this pandemic around, along with other preventive interventions which we have heard are unfailing. We seem to have discovered a microbicide which works. A microbicide is a cream or a gel or a foam which is vaginally applied and which can prevent transmission. And they're now looking at a ring which can be inserted and discharge the anti-transmission determinants over the course of a month or two, so that a woman does not have to spend her life anticipating the sexual encounter. And it's rooted in one of the antiretroviral drugs, so that it appears that it is likely to be successful. It had a success rate of 52% over 24 months and 39% in a shorter period of time. And when it was announced at the International AIDS Conference in Vienna, I witnessed something I've never witnessed before. The media got up and applauded, because it was the first major breakthrough which would restore power to the woman in the sexual transaction, where women normally have no sexual autonomy whatsoever. And we now know as well that male circumcision can reduce transmission by between 50 and 60% for the men who are circumcised. And that, again, is another part of the reinforcement of the preventive interventions. So we're really on the cusp of a breakthrough. And what happens at the moment it looks as though we can subdue the pandemic, the resources start drying up. And just last week, the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, Tuberculosis, and Malaria, the chief vehicle for funding these contagious communicable diseases, said that it couldn't have another round of grants in 2011. It would have to wait till 2012. And the amount of money they expected to dispense was reduced from $1.5 billion to $800 million, because a number of the donors, particularly in Europe, had decided dramatically to reduce their contributions or to make no contribution whatsoever. And the major presidential fund in the United States, called PEPFAR, has been flatlining the monies. And there is an incipient panic growing on the ground in a number of African countries as people who need treatment are standing in line waiting for someone to die who is now on treatment in order to take their place. Projects simply do not have the money to expand the provision of services, and there is a danger that we will revert to the situation of the late 90s and the early 2000s, when death stalked the land of so many African countries. It is an excruciating prospect. And what is even more heartening as we try to struggle with the resources is that we're beginning to look at what are called the high-risk groups much more closely. Men who have sex with men, sex workers, injecting drug users, prison populations, immigrant groups. All over the world, these high-risk groups who are driven underground by the prejudice, stigma, and discrimination visited on them by society, they don't go to get tested, they don't go to get treatment, they don't engage in prevention, they become the vectors of the disease. The reason I was in Moscow was to speak to the question of injecting drug use and the consequences for HIV. And as a matter of fact, I started the speech by referring to the decision on Insight, which was great fun to be able to say British Columbia leads the way yet again. It was a great victory. And it's just amazing the way these authoritarian regimes work, where they criminalize everything rather than decriminalizing so many aspects of human existence, and refuse to see injecting drug use as a disease, as a disability, as an illness, and see it only in a punitive context. And the consequences, of course, for injecting drug users are catastrophic. And then, after one has dealt with all of this financial falderall at the upper levels, one is left with what happens on the ground. That's why I love the foundation. Look, I might as well come to terms with this finally, publicly. I'm irrelevant to the foundation. I chair the board. The board is a great rubber stamp outfit. We meet on a regular basis and we look carefully at issues. But the decisions are made by the staff. It's very unusual for a foundation to work that way. Most foundations tell you when you submit a proposal, well, we'll hear it at the next proposal group, which will be 6 months from now, when we all gather together to decide what we will approve. No, the foundation has a completely different philosophy. We will respond instantaneously to a vexing moment in the human condition, when people need us, when there are orphans and grandmothers and women living with AIDS and others who are subject to sexual violence and are worried about transmission. That's when we will respond, and we have wonderful staff who seem to pull all of this together with exemplary urgency. And I love that about the foundation. And the relationship with the recipients is one of a family. It's not a donor relationship. It's a friendship. And it's wonderful when one travels around Africa to see the intensity of the solidarity. It's quite moving. And as we attempt to deal with the diminution of funding at the top, I beg you to remember that at the grassroots, on the ground, at community level, people are struggling, people are working, people are heroic in the degree of intervention and community. And that's where the foundation works. It works on the ground, and that's why we talk about turning the tide of AIDS in Africa, because at community level you can feel the progress. It's impervious to the craziness that afflicts some of the international organizations. It just doggedly and methodically works on protecting and preserving the human condition and fighting human vulnerability at the grassroots. And the 7th Millennium Development Goal was to maintain environmental sustainability, and I won't deal with that because I teach climate change at Ryerson, and I feel entirely apocalyptic about it. And since this speech has been filled with grace, light, hope, and mirth, I'm not going to introduce a solemn and unhappy dimension. But by God, if we don't reduce the discharge of carbon, my children and grandchildren will inherit the malice of capitalism. And the 8th Millennium Development Goal is to build a partnership between developed and developing countries so that developed countries don't betray the developing world the moment the commitments are made. And all of these Millennium Development Goals are being taken seriously as matters of public policy by countries all over the world. And I love the fact that there is now some turbulence emerging everywhere with the occupying movement and the You know, if you will forgive the nepotism for a second, I listened to Naomi Klein speak at the occupying movement in New York, and I heard about Michelle Landsberg speaking to the Toronto occupiers this afternoon, and I thought, I don't have to be incendiary anymore. I can come to Salt Spring and revert to the moderation which cleanses my soul. And I simply want to say to you that there is a kind of subterranean activity going on in this world, and it's important to have hope, and it's important to keep fighting, as Judy said, until the pendulum swings. You know, you grit your teeth, and you're tenacious, and you're indomitable, and you keep hammering away at the Philistines until one day the pendulum does swing, and there are moments of enlightenment which can be glimpsed, and it makes a huge difference to the way in which the world works, and the way in which the 99% finally receive what is their due. And on the ground in Africa, there is a wonderful feeling, particularly amongst the women, of solidarity and hope in the midst of terrible, terrible pain in so many countries. There was an anecdote in the book I wrote many years ago on the Massey Lectures, which was a real turning point for me. I was in the University Teaching Hospital in Lusaka in Zambia, and I was visiting the pediatric ward. And I was going through the ward with one of the loveliest superintendents I'd ever encountered. Quiet, calm, decent man, torn to shreds by what he was observing on a daily basis, but somehow coping. And in every cot, there were 5 or 6 little morsels of infants, obviously ricocheting between malnutrition on the one hand and the virus on the other. And as we were going through the ward and he was commenting on this child or that child, there was a terrible shriek which reverberated through the ward. And I remember swiveling around with a kind of compulsive anxiety, wondering what in God's name was going on. And there in the far corner of the ward was a young woman on her knees, weeping inconsolably as the nurse came in and covered the infant babe with a white sheet and took the babe away. And what was so overwhelming about it was that it happened every 5 or 10 minutes. I was in the ward. And even when we left and went out into the quad, through the windows of the ward came another agonized cry and another inconsolable mother. And I will admit that I stood at that moment and looked in the ward and said to myself, has the world gone mad? We have the knowledge to create pediatric formulations. We have the resources in this world to treat the human condition. It is not necessary for so many people to be struggling so painfully with a plight that can be overcome. And so with every fiber of my body, with every dimension of my molecular structure, I want to thank each and every one of you for your support, your awareness, your caring. I'm not some innocent romantic about the world, but I do believe that there is a kind of understanding and faith and caring which unites people of goodwill, and that if we can be united around overcoming the pandemic, then it will be an immeasurable contribution to the well-being of many, many societies. Thank you for having me.
Stephen, thank you very, very much for that. I just want everybody to know how much of this Stephen has done himself. He's very modest. But when he was talking about the UN Women's Agency, that was his vision, and Paula's vision as well, right? There are many, many things that Stephen has started happening that are now happening. And he won't tell us what they are, but we know them. And I think what's going to happen now is that Patricia's going to say a little bit about the grandmother movement here on Salt Spring, and then it's going to be open for questions.
Hi, I'm Patricia Brown, and myself, and I can look around in this audience and see many other women came together 3 years ago to form the Grandmothers. Sue Mowat over there, she's hiding. I wanted her to come up on the stage with me. She's another indomitable Salt Spring figure, and she just said, let's make it happen, and we did. And we have done 3 Scrabble tournaments. We'll be doing another. We have done dinners and collecting toonies and showing films. And our group, I'm very proud to say, has sent $34,000 in 3 years. And it's because of all of you supporting the vision. So I would invite anyone in the audience. We call ourselves grand-others to grandmothers because, first of all, it's all women right now, but we have a vision too. We'd love to have some men join us. And also, any of the women that are moved to come and join our group, we would love it. Bring your energy, bring your wonderful ideas. It would be terrific. So I would like to, at this time, we are going to be passing baskets to fund the organization, to fund the grandmothers. If you have been inspired, put something in the basket. It can be a check. If you want a receipt for $20 or more, you can put a check in the basket, put receipt please. If you have cash and want a receipt, we have tables over there. And I would like to thank Stephen for joining our group today. Thank you so much. Judy, who is part of the reason, or a huge reason, that Stephen came to join us. The high school for helping us have this space, bring the chairs, etc. And this delightful young man, John Michael, who came to us and said, okay, well, we have the Art Spring space. It's got 275. But if the grannies want to help, we'll put it in the gym. And we said, we want to help. Because we knew these people would come. So thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Patricia. And as Patricia pointed out, we are here in the high school, and this is more than just a venue. It is the place and the home of an amazing community of young people. And I just want you to all take note. It is a Saturday night, and there's an incredible number of young people here. I think that's amazing.
There's clearly something wrong with them, Michael. We'll discuss this afterwards.
Well, as Stephen points out, that's not something that just happens. It happened because this school community, the teachers, the administrators, and some of the amazing student groups in this school have rallied around Stephen's return to Salt Spring. For the past few weeks, they've been talking about the issues Stephen just spoke about in their classrooms. They've been screening Judy's films at lunch hour. They've been postering the school. They put together special student tickets so that everybody who wanted to come could afford to come. And most amazingly, the student government and some student leadership groups went classroom to classroom, and they gathered student questions from everybody, that came out of the classroom discussions. And so I think it's only appropriate that we recognize the students here tonight by beginning our question and answer period with 3 questions from GISS students. And after that, we're going to turn things over to the floor, and there's far more questions tonight than Stephen will ever be able to answer, but we'll try and get to as many of them as you can. I'll ask everybody to keep their questions as brief as possible so that there'll be time for other people to ask their questions as well. And I'm sure Stephen will be very brief in his responses. Of course. But without any further ado, I'd like to introduce the incredibly dynamic leader of the student government, Ava Olenek.
No.
All right, perfect. Thank you everyone for coming to our school. I'm really excited to see such a mix of the community. As John Michael briefly mentioned, what student government really tries to do is to get as broad a perspective from the students as possible. So we really try to create as knowledgeable of a student body we could. And that is what our questions are hopefully going to relate to. So first, Lauren is going to ask the first question.
Hi, I'm Lauren Utter. I'm a grade 11 student. This is my first year in student government, and our question is, during the 2 decades you worked with the UN, what do you view as your most impactful experience?
Well, I imagine that I imagine that you would expect me to say work that was done and what I learned around HIV and AIDS. I think if I'm looking at it as directly as possible, it would be what I learned in the years with UNICEF and before. Because I worked for a while under a remarkable progressive leader of UNICEF, a man named Jim Grant, who was probably the best Undersecretary General I've ever seen at work, who made children's issues come alive internationally, and who brought to fruition the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And the Convention on the Rights of the Child has transformed the rights of children around the world. And working in that environment, even though I wasn't entirely enamored of his successor, and I'm putting it as diplomatically as I can, nonetheless, the strength of the agency and what it did at country level for children really gripped me. And it was partly the reason of the strength of the agency that I wanted to end up working on HIV and AIDS, because every time we thought we were making progress in Africa, we were foiled by the presence of the AIDS virus, taking the toll and lives of children. But I think the UNICEF experience, I'm interested myself in thinking of it that way. But I think that would be the moment when I felt we made the greatest impact through the Convention on the Rights of the Child.
My name is Maddie Nash, and this is my 3rd year at Gulf Island Secondary School, and my 3rd year being a part of our student government cooperative. My question is as follows. What is the Canadian government doing to help in the fight against HIV and AIDS? And in your personal opinion, how do you think they can be more effective in their efforts? Thank you.
Maddie, as I'm going to try to discipline myself in response to that question, kind of supernatural self-discipline. It's a very good question. The Canadian government withdrew funding from the International Partnership on Microbicides at precisely the moment when microbicides became a real possibility to protect women. The Canadian government withdrew funding from the International AIDS Vaccine Initiative when the possibility of a vaccine based on a trial in Thailand 2 years ago became an actual possibility. The Canadian government's contribution to the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, Tuberculosis and Malaria is roughly at half the level of what it objectively should be. The Canadian government has frozen foreign aid until the year 2015, which means inevitably that there will be a significant reduction in monies available for many of these priorities. In other words, I am not alive with appreciation for what the Canadian government has done in relation to this issue. And I'll give you an interesting juxtaposition. In the year 2003, the World Health Organization conjured up an idea that they called 3x5. And the purpose of that was to put 3 million people into treatment by the end of the year 2005. And in order to get it done, we needed to place in all of the countries where there were high prevalence rates experts who could help the government in implementing the treatment. But it had an enormous cost associated with this. And Paul Martin, who was then Prime Minister, agreed to give the World Health Organization $100 million. And at that moment in time, Canada's role was indispensable because it allowed the World Health Organization to put the treatment into place in country after country using the experts they had at hand. And that has led to the 6 million people we now have in treatment as the treatment is gradually rolled out. And that was the kind of contribution which a country like ours should in truth make. But at the moment, it's not making the contribution because for reasons I don't understand, there's no feeling or sympathy or concern. The most dramatic evidence of that, of course, came when the government used the Senate to kill the bill which would have created generic drugs for export to countries that needed them. That bill which grandmothers groups all across Canada fought for so vigorously. The idea was that you would have generic drugs equivalent to the brand name drugs, but at much, much reduced cost, and we would manufacture them in Canada, consistent with the World Trade Organization intellectual property rights, and we would get them to the governments that needed it. In the course of 6 years of battling, we got only one shipment, and it went to Rwanda, and it turned out it was for pediatrics. It was to save the lives of children. So we begged the government, why would you be opposed to drugs that will save the lives of children? The brand name pharmaceutical company was being paid a royalty, and there was an absolute guarantee that the low prices that were being charged in Africa would not be charged anywhere else outside of Africa. The high prices would continue to be paid in the Western world. But the pharmaceutical industry fought it, and the government bought it. And what was so interesting was when it was debated in the House of Commons, it passed 171 to 126. I think I have the figures right. And 26 or 28 of those votes came from the Conservative government side. So having lost it in the House of Commons, and the law would have become real, the Conservative government used the Senate to block the passage of the bill, and we lost the capacity to export the generic drugs. So my feeling is that I could make many suggestions to the government, which are fairly obvious, on what they should do, but we're not likely to receive a receptive response. And is there a third? Yes.
Thank you. My name is Eva Olinik. This is my 4th year in student government, and my 2nd year as chair. Here with me is Laura. She is our next generation of student government. My question is, did you first get involved in humanitarian efforts as a youth? And if so, what do you think is the most effective way that today's youth can make a difference?
Yes, I don't know whether you would call it humanitarian. I'm not sure I saw it in those terms because I lived in a very political family, so everything was political. And I did get involved in international affairs early on. I remember I went to an NDP convention when I was 16, and I took the microphone and argued that Canada should withdraw from NATO because NATO had turned into a military adventure. And I was blocked in that process by a fellow named David Lewis, who took the platform at the top of the podium and said that I was full of it, and that he could authentically argue that I didn't know what I was talking about. That was obviously, it is a moment which I revisit in my dreams on a regular basis. It haunts me as an adult. I did get involved when I was 16, 17, 18 in international things. As a matter of fact, when I was 21 years old, I was already in Africa. I flunked out of university I had a remarkably dismal university career, and I flunked out and went directly to the United Kingdom and then to Africa. But I think the best way for young people to be involved is to get engaged with one of the NGOs that really does terrific work on the ground. And that can be a multilateral organization like UNICEF, or it can be CARE, or Save the Children, or Doctors Without Borders, or World Vision, or Free the Children. Craig Kielburger is doing some fascinating work in the schools across the country, and building schools in Kenya and doing community work in Malawi. And I mean, there are these terrific NGOs, many of them with chapters in schools, that can be, can be joined by young people. And I think that's the best way to get engaged. And if you don't want to do it in that kind of humanitarian work, it can be done in the environmental field, because there are endless environmental groups. I've always wanted to be David Suzuki when I grow up. I'm crazy about the guy. I think he's an absolute phenomenon. I can't get over him. I was on a platform with David in Montreal 3 or 4 days before the last election. I guess it was the end of April. There were 4,000 university students in the audience, and David Suzuki made the best speech I have ever heard in my life. And the reason I loved it was that he lacerated capitalism as I've never heard it lacerated before. And I thought, wow, I've still got some years left. I'm going to emulate David. So there are always NGOs to join. John Michael has a microphone in his hand, and he's hoping that somebody else will put up their hand and ask a question. Oh, good.
I am Lucy, a Pearson College student from Democratic Republic of Congo.
Yes,
my question is it political instability the main cause of sexual violence in Congo?
Is it?
The political instability.
You know, I think there are many reasons for the conflict. Probably the main reason is what happened after the Rwandan genocide, when so many of the génocidaires went into Congo, what was then Zaire, now Congo, and began the process of the last 17, 18 years of disrupting the Congo through violence, so often expressed as sexual violence. And then there were numbers of militias of other groups and other countries who came into the Congo primarily to go after the minerals. Now, in today's Saturday Globe and Mail, there is a stunning article on pages 12 and 13, just to show you how close my attention is, by Jeffrey York, the Globe and Mail's African correspondent, dealing with the minerals of the Congo and the way in which they have helped to perpetuate the violence. And the search for the minerals, many of which are used for cell phones and for computers, and I mean, they sustain much of what we do with current technology. The minerals often drive the violence as, let me put it quite simply, rape is no longer a weapon of war. Rape is a strategy of war. What so many of the militia groups have understood is that if you go into a community and you rape all the women, you humiliate the entire community, and you move the community off the ground below which the minerals lie. And it's terrible because it seems to happen around mineral wealth all the time. And Jeffrey York's article is tremendously worth reading. It's really fascinating because the mining has diminished in the Congo over the last while because there's a law emerging in the United States not to purchase the minerals that are produced because they are leading to sexual violence, just as we subjected the blood diamonds in Sierra Leone and Liberia to what was called the Kimberley process to make sure that they weren't being used to sustain civil war. And that's what we're beginning to look at in the Congo. So political disability is part of it because the Kinshasa regime is not strong and it doesn't really care what happens in the eastern region of the country. But it's really primarily the tremendous guerrilla warfare which followed the Rwandan genocide complicated fiercely by the mineral wealth of the Congo. I love the fact that we're getting student after student after student. And you'll notice of a certain gender. Yes?
Mr. Lewis, thank you for your presentation. My name is Anastasia. I come from Ukraine and study at Lester Pearson College. From your speeches, if I understood correctly, you told that the reduction of transmission of HIV and AIDS and prevention of the spread of this disease, it restores equal rights to women. But at this point, I do not understand why the reduction of the disease transmission is the way to restore women's rights. And it's also the men who get the disease, and why it's specifically that the women's rights are restored. And if a woman has HIV, why does it mean that her rights are not equal?
Well, if I understand correctly, let me try to alter one part of your equation. If you look at the continent of Africa, overall, 60 to 61% of all the infections are women and girls. And if you look at the age range between 15 and 24, between 75 and 78% of the infections are young women and girls. So that it's terribly important to focus on the vulnerability of women and girls, which is largely an extension of the lack of any sexual autonomy, the inability to say no to sex, the inability to say you must wear a condom. It's a cultural phenomenon which is terribly diminishing to women and girls. So what one must do is create a society, and it takes a long time, that empowers women and girls. It gives them some economic power, gives them some political power, and makes them less vulnerable to predatory sexual overtures. And you've also got to be able to deal with men and boys to change their sexual habits, and that's a matter of 1 or 2 generations. I don't think there's any question of that. So it is pretty clear that the vulnerability of women is intense in the context of transmission of the virus. And therefore, it becomes a matter of women's rights to make sure that they are empowered to defend themselves. Okay? Yes?
I recently read in Kenya that there is still a belief system that a man thinks if he has sex with a virgin that he will be cured of HIV. Is that still a belief system there?
There are 2 mythologies in Africa which are frequently reported by the Western media. One is the one you've just suggested, if you have sex with a virgin, and the other is the suggestion that if you have sex with an infant or a very young person, that you'll similarly either be cleansed of the virus if you have it, or obviously you won't contract. There's no question that those ideas do exist, but they've been wildly blown out of proportion, I think. They exist in very tiny groupings or kernels of activity in one country or another, but they don't fundamentally drive the pandemic. The pandemic in Africa is driven overwhelmingly by heterosexual activity, although I sit, and this is a real privilege, and I don't know how it happened, and I'm just glad it did. I sit on something called the Commission on HIV and the Law, which has been appointed by the United Nations Development Program and UNAIDS. And it's made up of 15 commissioners drawn from around the world. And we are looking at questions of decriminalization and dealing directly with the high-risk groups, men who have sex with men, sex workers, injecting drug users. And it's really interesting that on the continent of Africa, when you open up a dialogue, as we have done in every region, and invite papers and the presentation of groups themselves, that suddenly the question of men who have sex with men and the violent homophobia in so many societies, or the sex workers, in almost every regional dialogue, the most informed, the most vigorous, the most enthusiastic, the most articulate, the most intelligent presentations that were made by sex workers. I just couldn't get over it. It was phenomenal. And you suddenly realize that in all of these countries there are these high-risk groups that are vectors for the virus by virtue of what the society does to them, that you have to take notice of. So in Africa, where we always thought it was purely heterosexual transmission, it still is overwhelmingly heterosexual transmission, but there are a number of other groups who are also involved in transmission to which attention must be paid. But these particular mythologies which exist in pockets here or there are, I think, overblown. Hi.
Hi, Stephen. My name's Kelda, and I'm the vice principal here, so I'm very privileged to work with.
Well, congratulations.
Yeah,
it's a great school.
I just wanted to let you know that there is nothing wrong with our students here, that they're here on Saturday night. They are truly amazing, and we're in very good hands. So just wanted to let you know that.
That was a nice preamble, and I'm appropriately wounded.
My question, one of the things that I do is I help to support the global awareness group here at the school, and a lot of our work is trying to raise money for schools in mainly Lesotho, but also Kenya and places like that. So we do a variety of things. We try to raise money for gardens, for scholarships, for supplies, that kind of thing. And I wanted to sort of ask a question about education, because it seems like these schools are centers for so many other things. They take in orphans, they feed them, they grow food, they start hospitals and clinics. And have you seen some of that, and is that something that you're noticing around Africa?
It varies dramatically from country to country and district to district. It happens that I'm crazy about the little country of Lesotho. It's almost my favorite country in Africa. And it was really struggling. I mean, it's a little over 2 million people, and it had a prevalence rate of 30%, which means that 30% of its citizens between the ages of 15 and 49 were infected. And sometimes I wondered if Lesotho and Swaziland would continue to exist as separate nation states. And I can remember spending a lot of time with the Minister of Education in Lesotho, who was very resistant to teaching about HIV in the schools. It was quite interesting. But that doesn't diminish the fact that the schools are doing what you said they're doing. They're having community gardens, and they're attempting to integrate the community and be a sort of a resource center for needs. But the capacity to educate young people against the virus, which is how the school system should absolutely be used, just varies dramatically. I've sat in a grade 5 class in David Livingstone Primary School in Harare in Zimbabwe, and all the kids were 10 years old. And the teacher, who was doing a class in sort of life skills, wanted to teach the kids about AIDS. So she very inventively said to them, I'm going to hand out these pieces of paper, and I want you to write on the piece of paper what it is that bothers you most, what worries you most, and then we're going to collect them in this basket, and we'll pull them out one by one, and we'll talk about them in class. And there must have been 80 to 100 kids in the class. And 8 out of every 10 kids wrote the word death. Death of a father, death of a mother, death of a friend, an aunt, an uncle. It was incredible. And I remember the teacher saying to them, well, what do you do with all this death? And these little 10-year-old kids said, we pray. And prayer became the solace on which they depended in the face of going to funerals at lunchtime and after school and on the weekends. It's not as bad now, although Zimbabwe is still obviously a very troubling place, but the prevalence rate has come down in Zimbabwe. But watching that at the school, because then when she started drawing out the notes, these kids, 10 years old, they knew everything there was to know about sexuality. They knew heterosexuality, they knew how the virus was transmitted, they knew about homosexuality, they knew about contaminated blood supplies, they knew about needle exchange, they knew about everything, and many of them were orphans. That was exhilarating to see that a school was taking it so seriously. But in many jurisdictions it doesn't happen, although the school remains a nucleus for awareness in the community at large, which is as it should be. I've sat with Graça Michel in a number of schools with grade 7 and grade 8 students, and the girls will say to Graça, well, I wore a short skirt and I deserved what I got. And Graça, I can remember this, Graça intently and vigorously trying to convey to the young girls that this wasn't the status for sexual assault, and clothing was not a... But they have adopted so many of the irksome values that infest parts of this society that you're constantly wrestling with it. So the schools have to be the ultimate answer. There's no question, but it's slow. It's very slow.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I am Isaiah from South Sudan. I am at Pearson College. So my question was, you have talked about you and some of your colleagues trying to put forward things about, probably if I can call it, indiction of Mugabe about the crimes that are being committed in Zimbabwe, but it didn't work out because of some opposition from the UN General Assembly. So my question is it possible if you get probably an ICC arrest warrant for him? Is it more effective? Because I've seen cases where some leaders that have been indicted for some crime are not brought to justice. So can you say it was just an attempt, or can you say it was supposed to be a reality?
So it's a good question, and I want to welcome you as the newest country in the world, South Sudan. I want you to know that when I was just a couple of years older than you are, I was in jail in Juba. So I want you to know that we share something that's very important. Of course, in part, you're speaking about al-Bashir and the International Criminal Court indictment of al-Bashir, the president of the other Sudan. And you're quite right to raise that question, because there are two matters that are being frequently raised. One is by the African community. Why are you always indicting Africans? Why aren't you indicting others? You know, you'll indict al-Bashir, you'll indict Joseph Kony, the head of the Lord's Resistance Army, you'll indict Gaddafi, etc. Why aren't you indicting others in this world? Why aren't you indicting George Bush? Why are you always indicting African leaders? We could never get an indictment of Mugabe, because it would have to be referred by the Security Council for a request for an indictment, and China would block it, because at the moment China is buying the diamonds which have been discovered in Zimbabwe, and they will not have that interrupted by a reference to the International Criminal Court. So the way we're hoping to get at Zimbabwe and some of his thugs in the cabinet is through the principle of universal jurisdiction, where some countries take the statutes of the International Criminal Court and they domesticate them. It becomes the law of the country, as is the case in Canada. So Rwandans who participated in the genocide have been tried in Rwanda. It's the way Spain captured Pinochet and made sure that he would be tried for crimes in Chile. It's a matter of using this special jurisdiction, and we're hoping we can find a country like Botswana or Zambia when the members of the cabinet or others who are senior in Mugabe's administration cross the border, as they so often do, they could be captured and indicted. It's just a different vehicle, but we're looking at many vehicles. I don't think it will work in Zimbabwe because it would be blocked at the Security Council level. But this is a very difficult situation. I mean, you're from a country which has the oil, and you deserve to have that oil to rehabilitate South Sudan, which has been devastated by al-Bashir. But of course, the conflict at the border now over the control of the resource is threatening another civil conflict in Sudan. I remember I was traveling in Sudan with David MacDonald when he was Mulrooney's representative on Sudan. And we were meeting in Khartoum, and we were meeting, believe it or not, in the midst of this endless conflict with someone called the Minister of Peace. And I remember David saying to him, "How do you call yourself the Minister of Peace when there is nothing but war?" And he said, "Oh, no. When we have finished the war and killed them all, there will be peace. And that's my ministry." And he was absolutely straightforward about it. So you're dealing with very demented people. And it isn't an easy job. Anyone else?
Hi, Mr. Lewis.
Oh, sorry, yes.
My name is Gabriel Quigley. And I have a question regarding well, there's a belief that lots of humanitarian efforts generate social and economic inequalities within those communities. And I'm just wondering how you'd respond to that belief.
Well, I understand that argument. It is made by many that there is a certain dependency which grows on international aid, and if you pay aid workers better and you provide things that can't be generated within the community itself, then you distort the rationale for the community. And, you know, there's some truth to that argument. There's no question about it. But the reality is that in the aid we allocate compared to the aid which is distributed, there is a tremendous loss. It's called phantom aid. It goes to pay the consultants. It goes to pay the shipping. It goes to pay the people in the country from whom the aid comes. Economists like Jeffrey Sachs speculate that as high as 60 or 70% of the aid which is intended never gets there because it's siphoned off. So the problem really is the application and use of the aid monies rather than the distortion that occurs in the local economy. There is a much greater distortion, for example, for African agriculture, which is a desperate need. There's a much greater distortion because we haven't been able to come to an agreement on the Doha terms and remove the agricultural surpluses in Europe and the United States. And as a result, the productive agriculture is prejudiced in Africa. They simply can't export. They can't compete. We pay more per cow in the European Union, $2 a cow by way of subsidy, than people living in Africa who earn less than $1.25 a day. I mean, it's $1.25, yes, $1.25 a day, just crazy. So my feeling is that you can sort those things out if we change the nature of the international treaties, but it's not really a matter of what the aid itself does. And there are lots of very good international agencies on the ground that do terrific work. But it's just one of the many aspects which one has to worry about. Look at what China's doing. China is buying Africa. China is giving billions of dollars to the Congo for rehabilitation. China is giving billions now to Mugabe for his diamonds. China is buying up whole tracts of land for agricultural production, agriculture which will then be exported to China. It's not being used for the local inhabitants, and the local inhabitants are being turfed off the land. China, South Korea, Taiwan, they're buying up huge tracts of land in Sudan, huge tracts of land in Ethiopia, tracts of land in Madagascar. They bought up so much of the country that the president lost an election because the people got so agitated over the extraordinary loss of land about which they knew nothing. The government just sold it or leased it. So China is the new colonial power in Africa, and it's very, very worrisome. And it's now gradually being chronicled. That's a much greater danger to community integrity than aid.
My friends, I think we could go on much later, but the hour is getting late. I'm going to just go to one last question, and then we're going to say thank you to Stephen in true Salt Spring style.
God, I thought it was early, yes.
All right.
Hi, I'm Larissa from Pearson College in Hong Kong. And I was wondering, to what extent do you believe that the fight against HIV and AIDS can only be more effective if it springs from the people, like a change in attitude or culture, like, for example, how the revolution in the Middle East brought about a complete change?
Yes, in this case, we're fighting a disease rather than a regime. That's a really interesting question, Laura. I have to say, I fear that if we wait for behavior change, we'll wait a very long time, and inevitably huge additional numbers of people will become infected. You see, we're still running behind the virus. For every person we put into treatment, there are 2 new infections. So the virus is still outstripping our capacity to respond. So it's a grim race against time. And I fear that if we depend on behavior change as our primary vehicle, I absolutely agree that through education and through shift in attitudes and values, all of that is indispensable and vital, but it cannot proceed alone. So you've got to have male circumcision, and you've got to have microbicides, and you've got to have treatment as prevention, and you've got to fight like hell to discover a vaccine. You have to do all of those direct medical interventions as well as working on behavior change. Neither will work alone. They have to work together. I think I sense a looming presence, but we could shovel in another question before he realizes I'm finished answering this one. Go ahead.
My name is Abhinav. I'm from Nepal and Pearson College. Last question from Pearson College. My question is regarding the youth and acknowledgement of youth by the United Nations and big organizations. I represented Nepal and the youth of Nepal in a UN conference 2 years ago in Bangkok. And we were allowed to go in, but we were stopped outside the door where all the important people, the policymakers, were making decisions. And I felt very disappointed. And every time youth go to these conferences of the UN or the big organizations, the youth are allowed to step in. They're stopped before we get to talk to the policymakers to give our youth views. So my just question was, why is it that UN is so much afraid of taking as much youth views? I know UN has a youth division, but yet a lot of the young people's views are not reaching policymakers, and our views are much more different from what the policymakers have. And we are the future, but our views are not really reaching to the people who are deciding our future. So I was just wondering if you could answer that, if possible.
You know, they could use a political transformation in Nepal, and you might be the person to provide it. It's a very good question. It reminds me of the first World Summit on Children, which was held in 1990 by UNICEF. And literally 1 week before the summit, it suddenly occurred to UNICEF that no children were involved. And maybe it would be a good idea to round a few of them up and throw them into the mix. So we did that. We marched them into the General Assembly, and they took the podium for 5 minutes, and we pretended that youth had been very much involved when in fact they were entirely peripheral. I don't know what the fear and the objection is. I get a slightly different sense. I get a sense that gradually there is a more welcoming attitude to young people in the UN precincts generally. It isn't so much that they're afraid of the views. They just scorn young people's opinions. I mean, they're just contemptuous of young people. You see, they've managed the world so well, so very ably, that they don't need contributions from others, and especially not from young people who couldn't possibly reform what has already been put in place. So I don't even think it's a matter of worrying about the views. I think it's just adult contempt. And I think what you're seeing in the occupying activity around the world is a manifestation of young people emerging very, very strongly, which is delivering a very... I mean, you have to... here in Canada, the governor of the Bank of Canada says that the occupiers are entirely constructive. And you've got the Minister of Finance in Canada saying, well, there's a lot of inequality between the rich and the poor. It's the first time he's ever discovered that there's inequality between the rich and the poor. And it took the occupiers to do that, and they are mostly young people. So I don't despair. I think you just have to keep knocking at those doors. and don't be overly polite. Sometimes physical aggression is an excellent thing. I spent 15 years in the legislature wanting to leap across the floor and actually choke members of the cabinet physically. I contained myself because my caucus said it was undignified. But I urge you to keep hammering away, because that's how social change occurs. You just have to be unrelenting. Don't give an inch. You make a good point, and just understand that what's wrong with them is their contempt. It's not their fear of ideas or even of change. It's their basic contempt for young people, because you haven't yet graduated into the celestial aristocracy. And by God, in half a dozen sentences, you've sounded a hell of a lot more intelligent than the witless fools I deal with on a daily basis. Okay?
Come on up, everybody. And maybe if we could form almost a semicircle, that would be lovely. Sopranos can be on this side and the lower voices can be on this side. That'd be lovely. So, hi, everybody. My name is Barbara Slater, and I've been asked to teach you a chant so we can thank Stephen. This is a chant from Nigeria, and the meaning of the chant is that which the Creator made cannot be destroyed. And the words, I'll say them once, and then Kevin and I are going to sing them, and of course add whatever harmony you would like. And I'm going to sing a higher harmony, a suggested harmony, and then Kevin will sing a lower. But that's all just words. The words of the chant are, Ishe Oluwa Kole Bajeo. Very simple. Ishe Oluwa Kole Bajeo. Ishe Kole Bajeo.
sheolwa, koleba sheo, koleba sheo, koleba sheo.